Really, what I wanted to talk about were two things. The first was the appointment to the Canadian Senate of Charles Adler. Now, if you're over 50, definitely if you're over 45, I think, you've probably heard of Charles Adler, and you probably thought, well, where is he now? Because 20 years ago, he was the king of conservative talk radio in Canada. He was based in Winnipeg, but his show was carried pretty much coast to coast. He had a beautiful voice, perfect for radio and storytelling. He had a big heart, and he was very effective at making the conservative case. Plus, he had a bit of a knack for discovering talent. Our friend David the Menzoid Menzies was a regular appearer on Charles Adler's radio show, The Menzoid. And typically he just told funny stories, not even particularly newsworthy ones. Charles Adler even had a very young Ben Shapiro on his show once. Adler was the boss of Canadian conservative talk radio, and I would say I would consider him a friend. Back then, when the Sun News Network was started about 15 years ago, well, all of us were hired. Myself for the Ezra Levant Show. Charles Adler was hired for his show. Even David Menzies had some appearances. The whole gang got together, and it was wonderful. And Charles lived up to his billing as a conservative commentator, but he didn't last that long there. And soon, after the Sun News Network went away, well, things changed in Canadian talk radio that used to be the staple of Charles Adler. Basically, the word went out because, of course, most Canadian radio is owned by massive networks, massive chains. So there's really only about 3 companies that control the bulk of all the radio in Canada. And the message went out, no more right-wing talk. Just like the message had gone out in YouTube and in social media after Trump's victory, no more right-wing social media. The same thing happened in Canadian radio. And if you think about that, the truly conservative voices were either forced into retirement or told to tone it down. But Charles Adler, he adapted. He became slightly conservative. He became conservative with a lot of water poured in to water it down. And then one day, I think he just flipped. He just switched sides completely. Charles Adler became Trump deranged, Trump derangement syndrome. And then soon enough, Pierre Poilievre deranged too. And by deranged, I don't just mean being critics. Every politician deserves criticism. I'm talking about weird swears and weird insults and weird name calling, extremely personal. And it wasn't just against big shots like Trump and Poilievre. They don't need me to defend them, but ordinary people. For example, his raw hatred for the unvaccinated or people who didn't want to go along and follow orders of the state during the lockdowns. Charles Adler had enormous hatred for them. It was shocking. Some of the things he stood for in recent years were 100% or 180 degrees opposite of what he used to stand for. Here's an example. Charles Adler, like the rest of us, know that the CBC is a state broadcaster. That is literally what it is. It is a broadcaster owned by the state, whose mandate is written by the state, whose board of directors is appointed by the state, that is paid for by the state. There is no way in which the CBC is not a state broadcaster, and I don't even really think that it's a matter of opinion to say so. It's a matter of fact. Charles Adler, of course, used that phrase, as you can see here on Twitter. But in recent years, he decided that to do so was small-minded and partisan. I guess what I'm saying is Charles Adler spent until well into his 60s, he was an enemy of the left and the CBC until something happened in the last couple of years. He started associating with other crazy people like Dean Blundell, who was so atrocious that he was fired from his radio show over sexually inappropriate comment about minors. What was it that caused Charles Adler to become more and more disconnected from his entire life's work? Why did Charles Adler, who I would have called a friend back then, become an atrocious, appalling, hateful leftist? What was it? Well, I think we found out the answer over the weekend. Justin Trudeau appointed Charles Adler to the Canadian Senate. Adler railed against that too back in his day. Oh, he hated the Senate. He called it a barn or a farm. He despised it. Talked about abolishing it. Yeah, that was before he got a patronage gig from his buddy Justin Trudeau for it. Even the Toronto Sun that used to employ him as a columnist was grossed out and put it on their front page, even though he's their alumnus. And then I learned that Charles Adler actually applied for the job. He wasn't tapped on the shoulder by an angel and elevated to that heaven of patronage. He actually applied for it, begged for it, wrote for it, asked for it. He communicated with Trudeau and said, give me that job. And the entire time he was waiting for a reply, you could say it was fairly described as an audition. So every strange tweet attacking Pierre Poilievre suddenly looks different, doesn't it? Knowing that for months, perhaps years, Charles Adler had in his mind impressing Justin Trudeau. Frankly, Trudeau should have waited longer because Adler was an asset in the field. He was a secret Liberal partisan, didn't tell anyone he was angling for a job. Trudeau could have probably gotten another 4 years out from him. But now we know why Charles Adler made the flip-flop, why he became so vicious. You know, it's actually a bit of a tradition in Canada for politicians to appoint the odd journalist. Think about it. Pamela Wallin was put into the Senate, Mike Duffy, etc. Sometimes you want a journalist in there because they're effective communicators, sometimes because they have a public reputation, and sometimes because they care about freedom of speech. But that's unfortunately not the case with Charles Adler. He used to very much be in favor of freedom of speech, but now he's an embarrassment to free speech and journalism. He specifically trashed people who criticize Justin Trudeau for censorship. He actually came out positively to support Justin Trudeau's takeover in the internet in Bill C-11, which not only gave Trudeau domain over the internet by giving the CRTC the power to regulate the internet, but it also specifically gives Trudeau the power through the CRTC to throttle certain YouTube channels and boost others. Now, I was looking at some of the worst stuff that Charles Adler has said over the last few years. I was searching for keywords. It was just incredible to see who he was calling a Nazi, for example. And I thought to myself, well, maybe Charles Adler's going to grow up now. Maybe that was just him messing around in social media. I know what that's like. You're having a little bit of fun. And I thought of that phrase from, that passage from 1 Corinthians. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Maybe that's about to happen. Maybe Charles Adler is about to put his childishness away and rise to the occasion of being a senator. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the opposite. I think his childishness is specifically why he was appointed to the Senate. His vicious attacks on Pierre Poilievre and Republicans in the States is exactly why. He's so gross. And I think it's a constitutional crisis because we now have a Senate that is so overwhelmingly and so lopsided with Trudeau's appointments. I don't know what's going to happen if and when Pierre Poilievre finally wins office. Remember, Trudeau took over the Senate and it had, if memory serves me correctly, about 30 vacancies in it because Stephen Harper refused to appoint people to the Senate on principle, thinking, he'll just sort of starve the Senate out of existence. Well, that's sort of a foolish approach because Justin Trudeau inherited an empty Senate. He immediately stacked it with a bunch of buddies. So I think that we're in for a real constitutional crisis when Pierre Poilievre wins what I think will be a massive win, and the Senate simply says no. And I think Charles Adler will be a conservative smearer. I mean, he's already shown he'll sell his beliefs for some cash and a pension. I think he is eager to be the face of Trudeau in the Senate. I think it'll be his biggest audience yet. And I think the viciousness he's shown in recent years will be meted out against Trudeau's opponents. What could this look like in Canada if we go another 5 years down the road? If, God forbid, say, Justin Trudeau were reelected, which I don't think will happen, but it certainly could.